I'm Kevin McCaffrey. I'm a New Orleans-based documentary filmmaker, and I get to moderate the discussion because that's what it will be. Is we hope to all have a discussion about your process and what you've written and how you enter into learning, writing about, and presenting community. I've asked each of the participants, whose names you see here, to introduce themselves, their work, and how they approach their work, and how these books came to be in a way, and use those filters by way of self-introduction. And then we're going to have a discussion among ourselves and give you guys Q&A at the end or any clarifications or whatnot. So I guess we'll just go right to right of me.
All right. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. I know being on a panel on like the last day of a meeting of any kind gets to be difficult. But my name's Karen Cox. I'm a historian. I teach history, Southern history and culture at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And traditionally, my work has been academic monographs. But with this most recent book, which is called Goat Castle, A True Story of Murder, Race, in the Gothic South, it's a book that is set in Natchez, Mississippi, just a few hours north of here, on the bluffs of the Mississippi River. And I learned about this story while doing research on my last book, previous book, at the State Archives in Jackson, when a longtime historian at the State Archives said to me, I wanted to learn more about Natchez, I needed to look at Goat Castle. And that's about all he had to say for me, because I immediately went to the vertical file to get the clippings about this case, and I knew instinctively that I would write about it. And so in the fall of 2012, I went to Natchez for the first time, and I actually have a PhD in history from Southern Miss, so I'm unfamiliar with Natchez, but I went to Natchez for the first time, and that is part of my process, which is for me is to go to the place where an event occurred and spend time there and get to know the lay of the land, get to know the geography, get to know some people there before I actually dug into the research. And Natchez is a small town. It was Goat Castle. This was a murder case that achieved notoriety in newspapers because the original people charged with the murder lived in an antebellum mansion that was crumbling down around them and kept a pen of goats inside their house. And that became what the story was about, and that's why it became this sort of narrative of the Gothic South. So I went to Natchez. I started doing the digging, and for me, doing local history and even though this book is written differently and written in a more narrative style, because I would have ruined it if I tried to turn it into an academic book, I still used all the skills that I have as a historian in terms of digging up the details on the people who were involved. In one case, the woman who went to prison for this was a domestic who didn't have much of an education. These aren't people who leave behind letters and diaries and those kinds of things that help you learn about them as people. So I did her genealogy, eventually met her family members. And so it was a lot of digging, at the local level, but that digging really paid off. And I was able to write this book successfully. And I think now that I've done a book like this, I don't see me turning back and writing more, going back to the way of academia and writing these monographs that nobody reads or very few people read. and probably I am going to like continue some research in Natchez for the next book, which is on something called the Rhythm Club Fire. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but it was a fire in which 209 African Americans perished one evening in 1940. So I'll go back to do research there. I guess that's enough of an introduction.
So we kind of have similar paths. We both writing about small town Mississippi. So I come from a journalism background. I've been in journalism for about 10 years now, which is a really similar track, but a lot of differences from being a historian. The first of which is I have no idea what I'm doing, and I've never done it before. So I come from a long line of women, primarily matriarch families in the Mississippi Delta. I'm the first to be raised outside of that. My mom moved us out and raised us in Massachusetts, but I had originally gone down to the Mississippi Delta to learn about my family history there and the legacy of the women that were living basically off the land there for a long time. And when I got to the archives, I met an archivist, similar to Karen's story, who said, well, if you really want to know about the Delta, you got to know about the Chinese here. I said, what? I called my grandma up, and she said, oh, yeah, there was a Chinese store in town where they would cash checks, and it was a big part of the culture there that I knew nothing about. My mother knew nothing about. But I was just, as a journalist, I wanted to know how they got there, why they were there, what's the legacy of them. And for me, the most central part of writing is telling a story, and I didn't want to do a story or a book about this small ethnic community because I just felt like, oh, here's there's Chinese in the Delta. There's my book. That wasn't enough. I needed a narrative, which is when I found the story of the Lum family, which my book's called Water Tossing Boulders, How a Family of Chinese Immigrants Led the First Fight to Desegregate Schools in the Jim Crow South. And you can't see her here, but there's a 9-year-old girl named Martha Lum who in 1924 became the centerpiece of a case that would use the 14th Amendment in a way that would later be used in Brown v. Board to try to desegregate the schools in rural Mississippi. Specifically, the case was based out of Rosedale, Mississippi. So that right away I knew was a story, a 9-year-old girl taking on eventually the U.S. Supreme Court. Was just really fascinating, and it was, an immigration story and at the same time a very American story that merged together. So I spent about 6 years on the research, and I actually, my family and friends discouraged me from doing this, but I left a rent-controlled apartment in Manhattan and moved down to Cleveland, Mississippi, which, if any of y'all have been there, there's nothing in Cleveland. There's a beautiful school and a great archive and a whole lot of cotton fields. And it was a really, really stark change, but an incredible one. I lived there for about 3 years doing the research, and I had to. The records for this were literally in a jail cell behind the courthouse that had been locked shut, and they had been stacked, just literally thrown in there, the files, because the custodians of the records were the inmates at this jail. So, some of them really took an interest in preserving history, and some of them were ready to be out of their shift and just threw stuff away. So a lot of the time was spent digging through moldy records in an actual jail cell. So it's those kind of things where you have to go to these communities, and you have to know who to talk to, and you have to sit on their porch and drink tea with them and talk to them, week after week after week before you finally get that seed of information that helps you get to the next step. So for me, 6 years total reporting. In writing, it maybe took me 6-7 months. So, that's kind of the speed that we work in with nonfiction. But I really love the experience. I got to know my family there and met a lot of great people, met my husband there, and it was really a life-changing experience to work. This is my first book, and it really got me interested in the smaller communities within the South that are often overlooked, especially being raised in the North. You know, there's an image of what the South is, and I am constantly confronted with my own perceptions of how I was raised to think the South is, and challenged every time I visit and come down and see my family here in Mississippi. So we can talk probably more about methods and all that, but that's kind of the basics of where I'm coming from.
Welcome. My name is Sara Ann Harris, and today I'm talking about my book called The Dance Halls of Spanish Louisiana. I'll start by saying that even growing up, so I was very drawn to the natural world, and you know, as a young person, I learned about nature and camp or canoeing or sailing or backpacking. And as a writer, I came to understand that there's kind of a beautiful thing that happens when you follow your intuition. You sort of simply find yourself where you want to be in terms of a story. And where I found myself was writing environmental magazine features and producing a television series. But as my career continued, I became interested in not just in the wetlands and the woods, but the people who lived and worked in the wetlands and the woods, and that's who the Spanish Louisianans are. They are from that heritage. I came to appreciate that they have a way of understanding the natural world that is much, much more sophisticated than any city dweller like myself, who went to Camp St. Gertrude and got the nature prize. You know, I mean, they breathe it. They, you know, they watch the ripple on the water to determine if the speckled trout are running. They watch the changes in the moon and the tides to know if the shrimp will be flowing. It's remarkable to me because it seems so effortless. So I had a chance to start writing about those people. We did a television documentary, and what else did we do? Oh, I was doing magazine. I mean, I was doing newspaper articles that were being featured nationally. But on this particular book, and again, you just sort of stumble into it, and if you just keep putting one foot before the next and paying attention to your gut, and there you are. I was going down to St. Bernard Parish. If y'all are not from here, we're in Orleans Parish, and St. Bernard is right next door to us, and it runs from New Orleans down to the Gulf of Mexico. I was going down there to cover a bonfire. We have Christmas bonfires on the levee. It was on the Mississippi River levee, so they were having a big celebration, and we were there to support them, and at that time we were advocates for the seafood industry, so we were bringing seafood. But the elders in the group were speaking Spanish, and I was floored. I mean, everybody knows that the Spanish controlled Louisiana in the 1700s, but I had no idea that there was a Spanish Louisiana community anywhere, really. I mean, maybe anywhere here, anywhere in Louisiana. So I knew I had to come back, and I did, and found myself interviewing the Irvin Perez, who is the community patriarch, and he explained to me that there were still vestiges of their Spanish Louisiana culture from the colonial times. You know, singing Spanish folk songs, cooking Spanish Louisiana style dishes, speaking Spanish. Dancing, they had a passion for dancing. They still had a passion for dancing, just as they had when they first arrived, but they had become more Americanized in that way. And that's sort of what those, the fact that they were people who lived and worked in the environment, and they had a special understanding of the natural world was the underpinning of, the story and how it drew me in. But then when I found out, when I was learning about their Spanish heritage, it looked like the story that had never been told. I mean, that's how it felt. I mean, as a writer, you're always looking for something original and authentic. If you're from New Orleans and you're talking about the history of New Orleans, you're almost always talking about the French. The French bought the Louisiana Purchase. They founded the city of New Orleans. Their lavish lifestyle and rich food and outrageous, everything about the French is outrageous, but we're very much at the center of how we just our cultural identity in New Orleans. So for the general readership, I thought this could be a real original story, and it just gobbled me up for years, and now it's done. And thank y'all for coming.
Well, there's I guess a lot of clues here to everyone's process. The Isleño story that you're telling has been told by them back and forth themselves, and they began to research their own stories. And so you got maybe a few articles in Cultural Vistas magazine when it was so well edited at one point in time, and or different places. But I think you're right. It hadn't been sort of compiled and put together, and so you have a lot of source material there that was not only being remembered, but it was being retold, and you had the opportunity to put it together. It's kind of what I call cutting through the fog of familiarity, which kind of also brings us to one of the questions we were going to pose ourselves, in the sense that we have a professional historian learning the narrative trade in a way, I guess you just said. Am I right?
I just wrote it differently. I think I'm a pretty good writer in general, but it had to be more narrative, yes.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, so there was a learning curve, a little bit of one, yeah.
And then you had a learning curve. You said
Coming at it from the other angle, I'd never
right.
worked in history or even taken a history course, so I was finding a lot of people smarter than me to help me through that part of it.
For my part, I tell people sometimes I'm an archive rat. There's gym rats and then there's archive rats, and I'll go. I can get really lost, and if somebody would just be my Lorenzo de Medici and just pay me to plunge through archives and pull stories out, there are a lot of stories, and it's interesting that you all came to that. But in the end, the tools become, not only what's in the archives, but also the interviews and the personal contact and being there. I think, and I referred to this question a second ago, it gives you all, or does it give you all the credibility? I know everyone in this business gets asked at one time or another, what gives you the right to write about any of these subjects, the Chinese, and the Chinese story, by the way, not even in Mississippi, but y'all know that the Chinese were the ones who taught the Cajuns how to be commercial shrimpers, right?
I was shrimp drying.
So that's, huh?
That was the shrimp drying process. It wasn't just commercial fishing.
Right, dancing the shrimp. But anyway, so you get asked this, but I think it speaks to your process. So maybe you would speak to your process as to what allows you to write about these different things. Obviously, we've seen their enthusiasm for it.
Well, first of all, I wanted to go back to something you said, because there was a lot of finding where the records were. There were court records in what had been an abandoned pie factory in Natchez, and we had to call a guy named Bubba Chauvin to come open the building. It's like, I can't make this stuff up.
Who told you that? Who knew that?
Of the people at the Historic Natchez Foundation. Well, Bubba Chauvin has the key, so we had to wait for Bubba Chauvin to get done whatever he was doing for them to show up. This is part of working in a local community, is like things like that. Like, he was literally the gatekeeper of these records, and then, you know, getting in there was it was a nightmare what I found. And I was, you know, had gloves and a mask and was afraid, you know, something might run out from under something. You know, it was that kind of a place. But I think that what makes me, or allowed me to be able to do this, is that there is something, I would say I have a Southern sensibility, in that I respect the culture I go into. I respect the community that I work in. Whenever I'm doing that work, I send thank you notes, which is something that people don't do anymore. So that actually stands out when you do that kind of thing. I stayed in touch with the people, particularly the family of the woman who was incarcerated because of this murder. I made a point. I went to church with them, including one 3.5-hour session service. That was more than I had bargained for, but it was worth it, because that is, like, to me, is goodwill, showing goodwill to these people for what they're giving me. An oral history is a gift. When, you know, that person I get an interview with, that's a gift because they're giving me information. Then I feel a responsibility then to return that to them in the form of, you know, good research, a good book, a good narrative. And so those are the kinds of things that I did, and the fact that I would continue to show up in Natchez on a regular basis, and even if I wasn't working with a particular, you know, individual for research, I would reach out to them and take them to dinner or lunch or something like that, as a way of showing them how serious I was about telling this story properly, and that I did care about their community. And also I got to the point, I'd been there enough that I could actually give directions in town. It's not a big town, so that wasn't hard, but it's those kinds of things. It was also, I had to be very careful, because there had been a little booklet, I call it a booklet, a little book that was published on this, and the woman who's a journalist with the Natchez Democrat was there. I do believe that, you know, part of, like, in the way that story was told, the story was told through her book, left out this story of racial injustice that I was trying to return to the retelling, because it's like, in community memory in Natchez was all about Goat Castle and the weird, you know, eccentricities of these people. But I also wanted to be respectful that she had written a book before I did, and to acknowledge that, even if I might have disagreed with the end result of her own work. But again, I think it is just a matter of being respectful of the community and doing that on through all those things I mentioned.
And part of it too is, you know, I'm coming from a journalistic perspective, so sometimes ignorance is the best thing you can have in your toolbox, because you're going to ask the question, that no one else is asking. So a lot of times, because my family's from Mississippi, so I have familiarity, I have relatives there, but I was raised outside of there. So there was so much a part of the Delta culture that I didn't understand and wanted to understand and needed to understand. And so I was doing my homework. I mean, every day, I can't tell you how many books I would read just about, the town and the systems in place in the town, whether they were, within the cotton industry, within the racial hierarchies that were existing, within the family names. So I had to teach myself a lot of stuff that would have been taught to me probably incorrectly had I been raised there. And, what you say about talking about certain things that people work really exceptionally hard not to talk about is quite a challenge. You have to do it in a way. I went to a baptism my first week there, and the man was probably in his late 50s and was returning back to the church, so you can imagine the kind of party that was. So it's those kind of things where you really have to become a part of a community in a way that you maybe wouldn't even in your own daily life. It's a concerted effort to build these connections and make people feel respected, but you still have to push. I have to ask questions that are really hard. And I have to tell people, even during these oral histories, okay, I'm going to ask you a hard question right now, and, we're going to have to address this because there's no record of it, and there won't be any record of it unless you ask these questions. So that's part of it, too, is a challenge you bump up against. But, back to the larger question of who has the right to tell what story, I think it's a valuable one, and it's something that I've definitely grappled with myself. Other academics have talked to me about this. I'm not Chinese American. I don't, that's not my ethnicity, that's not my culture. So going into a community like that and telling them, well, I want to tell your story, who am I to do that? And what I have to say is no one else has done it. This case is almost 100 years old. If I don't do it, the people who remember it and know about it are dying off. There's a race against time to tell these stories, and I'm sure this should not be the definitive story, but it's the only one that's out there right now. I try to do it justice in a way that I feel proud of what I've done, but I do think it's a relevant question of who gets to tell what story and how, and that's something, going back as a historian, when you work with records, what records are kept and who kept those records tell you a lot about what was valued at the time in a society, and it makes it so much harder when you're in our position where you're decades later trying to recreate these lives, and there's nothing there for half of the people that are in my book just because of the class or race they were born into. It's really a challenge.
Okay. Well, I have similar experiences that both of the other authors talked about. It's clear that I was walking into a life, a community, a culture that I was not a part of. And I think it's enormously important to respect the storyteller, which I believe has been said. I felt compelled to let them know, just to make sure that they knew they were appreciated, because I felt like in the end, without question, it's their story. It's not my story, and so there was a lot. I put a lot into the relationships with the people that, and y'all have talked about that also. I did have the benefit of having worked with people who made their living on the waters and in the woods of Louisiana, so there was a certain appreciation for that lifestyle that I had. So I was able to bring that to it. And when, now where was I going with that? So I had that appreciation, but on those occasions where I had questions, I might be writing and interviewing and reading, in waves, and I might hit a wall or a question, and I find that if I pursued the question, it was very rewarding. It could reform the structure of the story, because it gave me another layer of information that I hadn't had, or even something tangential that I didn't know at all. And so it seemed to me that as a writer, I needed to be a student. But I wasn't in control of the product. I was a student studying the product and trying to give it its due. I found it to be really important for me. I thought it was really important for me to pay attention to the people's language, just like any place in Louisiana, every 150 miles, there's another handling of the language. And there were times in interviews where it was, if you hadn't spent time with the Spanish Louisiana people, you wouldn't understand what they were saying because their language was different. So I was able to spend enough time that I could just use parentheses in the book itself. I use parentheses to, I guess it would be translated for the general readership. And I thought that spending time with them, is everything. I learned the conflicts between different parts of the community, and that helped me to understand what their values were, what they thought was important, and how long they've been holding this resentment against a whole other town downriver. And that played into their conversation, their response to questions sometimes. So I thought that was my job. That was my, to respectfully try to give the account of what they meant when they expressed themselves. It was a fabulous experience. It's a fabulous experience when you have that much interest on so many levels. You can just, and in terms of reading, if you go to scholarly material or you go to historic material, you can find very useful information. Or you go to someone who's done a thesis. It's not in the general library, but you can find it. I have the bibliography. I thought I'd better go ahead and put together a bibliography. Is 12 pages long. So there's material out there. What I'm saying is that this particular story that is propped up by the dance halls, because the dance halls were the places where, because of their camaraderie, their culture, the dancing and the singing and the food, that was sustained and sort of propelled another, almost another 100 years. And that's the story that I'm talking about. It's not been told. So it was a real pleasure. It was. Thank you.
I think it was. I think it's interesting that you had mentioned. I've made a note that you had kind of gone to the elders of the culture, or started talking to some of the older people, as somebody coming at it even from an environmental standpoint. Some of the things that they know. You're talking about what I call traditional environmental knowledge, or what a lot of scientists are calling that. They know about resilience, and they know about conservation and all. And so did you find that that contributed to your knowledge base, or opening your knowledge of the culture as you spoke to them, and they kind of gave you the foundations?
Right. The environmental issues are something that I was better versed in, the science of it. I worked with scientists frequently. I read scientists' master's theses or whatever. I did their stories, you know, I sort of translated their stories into, you know, general readership. So, you know, the P's and Q's of management of the different species in the habitat I was real familiar with, and I was real interested to find out that they had their own sense of conservation, but I didn't use it because it sort of was taken, that would sort of take it off in another direction, and this was all about dancing and singing and cooking and, you know, getting caught in a hurricane, and yeah, I didn't use it, but you know, it was interesting. It was the elderly people, just by the by, it was the elderly people who had actually grown up in the dance hall, so this was not hearsay, this was primary sources. You know, they could tell you stories about what their uncle did, you know, what their uncle shouted at the band one night when, you know, and what dances they wouldn't do because they thought they were too risque, and I mean, they were there, you know. So it was...
It gives you a basis for the culture about what you're writing about. And
yeah,
and
I will.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
And then we'll come back, circle back
Okay.
on the Chinese culture and
Okay.
Okay.
There's a linguist, a scholar who's a linguist. His name is Samuel Armistead, and he referred to their know-how of the woods and waters as their bayou education, and he spoke very highly of it. And you know, there was this, not to go off on the environment, but there was in some context, there's an ongoing disagreement between the folks who work in the water and the folks, the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, who manage the fish and game. I mean, the folks who work the water say they don't know what they're talking about. They didn't grow up on the water, and the folks who studied it in a book say, well, they don't know what they're talking about because they haven't seen the results of this scientific. So it was an interesting, that's one of the reasons I didn't get into it, because it would have been, I could have been getting flack for that. But I'm sorry, so that's the bioeducation, and just one more phrase was, there's a respected historian, his name is Joseph Guillat, and he referred to the Isleños, or the Spanish Louisianans, as the masters of the marsh. I thought that was very fitting.
Now, you guys, you're prying open your stories, and you literally have somebody opening the door for you.
Bubba should have been.
Right. I mean, you know, a guy named, you know, I think the first thing you do is you got to find a guy named Bubba, right? But anyway, I think what's interesting is when you are coming into the community, you are after that, who do these people become collaborators as well as informants? How did your education evolve? That's probably what I'm really asking, right?
Well, I think once you begin something that's as foreign to you as the subject of my book was, you get to a point, I was probably in about year 3 or 4, that I realized the things that people weren't telling me and the things they weren't showing me and the people they weren't letting me talk to. So I went in with the idea of this is a collaborative effort, everyone's so great, they're super helpful, because I'm, you know, raised in Massachusetts, a Yankee coming down thinking bless your heart means bless your heart, and it does not. So I'm thinking everyone's being friendly, and this is the, you know, I'm getting the full picture, and I think you have to know the subject and the place well enough and the nuances of the culture to understand that I'm only touching one level, and there's 16 levels below that, and I'm just scratching the surface right now, which was a big indicator to me. That's really why I made that final move, is I needed to live there, I need to feel the place, I need to feel the people. So there's a way in which journalists operate, especially these days where they're low on resources and time. Well, they'll parachute in, and you know, it happened while I was living in Cleveland. They had a desegregation order from federal court to desegregate their schools, and we had the New York Times drop in for a day, and huge papers and huge magazines would come in, and they would stay for a day and talk to the people that everybody else had talked to, or that most people had talked to, and you just don't stay long enough to know that there's certain questions that you're not asking and certain people you're not asking those questions to. So I think part of it is you're building a relationship, you're building collaborators, it's a partnership with the community, and to the point when it's not, and to the point that you're poking holes in a story that you thought you understood. And for me, that was the most amazing part, was to be able to really see it. We talk about objectivity, but if it's a literal thing, I'm turning this story around so many times that I'm finally seeing all the sides of it in a way that I had never been able to before.
Yeah, I don't know if I thought of these people as the people I met as collaborators or as informants in terms of helping me to locate material. They were collaborators in the sense that, the ways and, the things, the information that they shared with me, or the way that which they spoke, or something like that might inform the way I might write the narrative. And in that way, I think they might have been. But for the most part, maybe in the research, but when you're the only one that gets to write the book. So at that point, no one else is collaborating with you. Although I still value the people that I met and the ways in which they may have helped me lead me into parts of the story I would not have found otherwise, and that was really, really key, and it was important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you? What I call, in documentary work, I call that sometimes the happy accident. When we are interviewing somebody, or something goes on, or somebody's demonstrating something and they slip or whatever, it's like, whoa, that's good video. So were there sort of surprises, and is the story you published the same story you set out to? In a way you don't set out. I mean, you sort of absorb the research, right?
I don't know if I had in my head what the way I was going to tell the story, but the one thing that was, as I mentioned before, in the collective memory of people repeating the story of Goat Castle year in and year out, decade after decade, and they had virtually erased this woman named Emily Burns from the story. They just completely erased her from the story, and she's the one who actually, aside from the woman who was killed, was the other victim in this case, because she was sent to prison, to Parchman no less, for something she didn't do. And so as I entered into this project, it's my goal all along to find out who Emily is. And I had to do her genealogy, as I mentioned. That was part of it. And I knew that she had been released from prison after 8 years. Her sentence had been suspended, but then I didn't know where she went. And so it was during an interview with a man named Duncan Morgan, whose memory you could take to the bank. I said, whatever happened to Emily Burns? Where, I knew she was released from prison. He says, oh, Miss Burns, she lived across the street from me, and she married Mr. Randolph. And then it was from there that I went to city directories. I found her as married to this man named Mr. Randolph, and then I went back in time in the city directories and saw that she had returned to Natchez. So I couldn't have written the book without knowing more about her. And the last little piece for me was an image of her, a photograph. I would have accepted a, faded Polaroid of her or something like that, and I was getting close in the fall of October 15 to sitting down to write this book, And I didn't have that photo. I had photographs of all the principals. I knew, you know, and there's something about that helps you to write, to have this image of this individual. So it was having gone to church, not knowing what I was going to run into, because I'd heard that her family's still there, worshiped there, from my different interviews. And so I went to church, and I met four women who were her second cousins, because Emily never had any children. And so, and she was known in the community. These are the kinds of personal things that you learn. Like, they call her, the community called Emily Sister. She didn't go by Emily. She was known as Sister, even though she didn't have any siblings. That was her nickname, and they called her Cousin Sister. And so it was meeting them, and then they, you know, and again, this is part of the goodwill of going into the church and showing that you're serious. And when they asked me to speak, I turned around and I spoke to the entire congregation about why I was there and why this was important. So the following day, I was invited to go to one of the sisters' homes, and it was there as we were sitting around a kitchen table talking about this case, about the things that they didn't even know had happened, because even in their family, they had not talked about their cousin sister having gone to prison. And during that conversation, one of the sisters went across the room and came back with this family photo from 1913. So it was the only photo existed, but it was the best photo that I could have had or could have found, because here was Emily, here was Sister in context. It was not a mugshot of her. It wasn't her at the prison in her prison stripes. It was her. It was a woman who was a human being who was part of a large family. Her mother was there, her uncles are in the picture, and including her grandmother, who had been born a slave. It was like that picture. I was like, if a picture's worth 1,000, that was worth 5,000 words to me. So, I'm not sure why I was telling this story, except it was one of the surprises, but one of the most special things to have happened, because even my editor said, when you found that photograph, your writing took off. And I do believe that you know, because then I had this image of who I was dealing with. I knew her story, but now I kind of felt like I knew her a little bit better. And I actually wrote an essay called Finding Emily, which you could find online if you were interested. It's a blog for the Organization of American Historians called Process. And so I wrote an essay about kind of the journey that I took to really find this woman.
How about you?
And yeah, it's a tough journey, especially, you know, the father in this case, who put his name on the case, came to the country. He was an undocumented immigrant who crossed over the frozen Detroit River. So there's no record of his journey to America, and there's no census records of him really until later in his life, because my guess is that he was probably dodging census takers. So, you know, when the records aren't kept, then you've got to turn to the family. So I was really lucky in that I met someone who had actually gone to church with one of the descendants, and they were still alive, and they live in Houston. And then through them, I met the entire family that's related to the family in the case. And one of them had studied documentary filmmaking in college, bought a camera, and decided to do an oral history of his grandmother, who is the mother in this case. And they had not specifically talked about the case by name, but they had talked about what had happened after it. Who the family did lose, and it was really a devastating loss for them and for ethnic minorities throughout the South. But she's sitting at a kitchen table. She's probably in her 90s when this is being filmed, and she starts hammering the table the way that she used to when she would bake bread, which was the only source of income for their family after they lost this case. They had gone from being store owners to being very, very poor, and then eventually during the Depression, extremely, extremely poor. And so I have the sounds that she made and the way she describes making the bread. And so I was able to put that scene, it's a full scene that I can write into the book. It's things like that. I always want to write a book that people can read with their feet up, that reads like fiction. And so you're always trying to find those scenes, and it can take you years. I mean, this was probably in my 5th year of research that I was able to get that scene, but it's, one of many that I was really lucky to get because the records weren't there to begin with, so you had to just rely on the family to get those.
Happy accidents for you? Or surprises? Or did Thomas Gonzalez ever tell you the Catfish Bowen story?
Well, yeah. I think I may have, I don't mean to repeat myself, but I found out just how important it is to be open to surprises, because that's, it's information that's delivered to you, either in someone's comments or in something that you're reading, and I would have a resistance to it because, if it's particularly good, I knew it was going to transform the book, which means I would have to rewrite a lot or rethink a lot, but it would add so much, like. Well, I'll just talk about, there was a conflict, for instance. There was an area that they called the turn in the river, Turno, the turn, and then there was an area they called the island. And at some point, originally they settled in 1778 or close to Turno. And at some point, when sugar plantations came into play and various folks from other parts of the United States came into St. Bernard and started growing sugar, it sort of pushed these Spanish Americans out. Some of them had the resources to buy enough land to be sugar plantation owners. Some of them took jobs in the fields, and some of them moved south to the island. And that's where they became the fishermen and the trappers. Well, somehow in that process, the folks on the island and the folks at the original location had rubbed each other the wrong way, and nobody. They would get close to it, and then you'd see them just back away a little bit, and that was 200 years ago. You'd see them edge up to it, and then they would, I was an outsider, and they weren't going to disclose that. And but what I'm trying to say is there were times when, as I might have mentioned, having come to the conclusion, or one of the informants was more forthcoming. We got to be really good friends. And he said enough for me to understand what I've just been relaying to you. But so I guess that was a surprise. That's just an example. There are probably a lot better examples, but it was an example of a reality in their life that I came upon because of my friendship with Irvin Perez, and I came to understand it a little bit better. And then when it would come up, I could see how it would skew the conversation or skew the dialogue, how it would influence it, or why this person wouldn't talk to that person, or they would put up a particular exhibit at the cultural center, why they didn't have a particular exhibit at the cultural center for. Anyway, I guess the point is that new information is problematic, and that's what makes it great. And it's important for me as a writer to yield to that. Thank you.
Right, yeah. I think it's also contributes to the joy of actually doing it, and in some cases sticking with it for 4 or 5 years, and however many, and getting deeper and deeper. And I guess speaking of that, are you all burning with questions? Do we have? We wanted to allow some time, so.
I have a question for Ms. Harris.
Okay.
So everything that you were talking about the ecology and environmentalism and everything, and you're speaking of St. Bernard Parish in particular, but I'm sure you've heard of the term Courrier de Bois. So what is your sort of take on how much of that is Spanish colonial versus French colonial versus native First Nation? I mean, for us, further west, it's deemed Cajun, but in my family line, I'm very aware of the fact that there's a lot of the other in there as well. So percentages of that natural environment, that know-how of when the shrimp are here, when to plant the rice, when to plant the sugar, when to do these things, and I'm not just talking about, an almanac. I'm talking about native language, native cultural knowledge. Yeah, I know.
How do you
A lot of stuff in there.
No, that's okay. So translate the phrase for me.
Courrier de Bois, runners of the woods. They're native runners of the woods, and as a Louisiana historian, of course, I'm familiar with both the Spanish colonial, the French colonial, the Native Americans, First Nation people that were all involved.
And you're curious about how early that started, or
Well, no, I'm curious
who
about
taught it to who, or
what percentage you would say was Spanish colonial.
oh, don't know. I mean, there's a way that people mesh and intermarry. They're Italians, they're Irish that are in St. Bernard Parish. If you ask the parish historian, the catchphrase for the Spanish Louisianans is isleños, because they were from the Canary Islands. So if I said to Bill Hyland, well, what percentage of St. Bernard Parish population do you think is isleños? He said they're all isleños. They're all Italians, and they're all Irish. So I couldn't tell you about. I'm not very familiar with that phrase, to tell you the truth.
Well, I mean, we all.
But anybody who's working on the water is sharing it with nearby cultures, and they're intermarrying, and then they're teaching their children, and then they're finding new ways, and then technology is allowing them to build more sophisticated gear, and then their life changes. So.
What led you to only think of Spanish colonial as being based in St. Bernard Parish?
Because they were.
Well, but Liberia has a plenitude of Spanish colonial people.
Oh, for the most part, what I have read is that when the Spanish brought the Canary Islanders over, as well as the Acadians, the Spanish brought the Acadians over, but the Canary Islanders were directed to settle in 4 places, 4 towns, 4 villages that surrounded New Orleans to protect New Orleans from the British. The British forever trying to take over New Orleans, and they never succeeded. Anyway, so one of the villages was on Bayou Lafourche, and I assume that's the group you're talking about. There was a lot of assimilation, from what I've read, there was a great deal of assimilation between the French Acadians and the Isleños, the Spanish Louisianans, and that Acadian culture was adopted, much more, was better integrated into the day-to-day life than the Spanish language, say. But I get pushback on that.
Okay. We have another.
Sorry.
We have another question here.
I have 2 questions. One is involving language. In either the archival work or the interviewing, did you have to familiarize yourself with the Spanish language, the Chinese language, Black English, to do any of this? My second question is regarding the dances that you said were too risque for the dance hall. Was that because of religious principles or families trying to protect the young women, or what? Why were some of the dances considered too risque?
Let's
I've
go here
been
first.
jammering. Why don't
Yeah.
y'all go in?
There isn't such a thing as Black English. It's English, and they may, have a dialect or an accent or something but it's English. So, no issue here. No, not at all. No, that's the only barrier is when Southern whites try to write in dialect.
I faced a lot of different issues with Cantonese. If you're a recent Chinese immigrant, you're coming from mainland China, mostly right now, and you speak Mandarin Chinese. The families that immigrated the time I'm talking about, which is the turn of the century, so late 1800s into early 1900s, they're coming from southern China, and they spoke Cantonese, which is entirely different dialect and language, and that language has died out almost completely in China and has died out here. So I had letters that were kept by Zhugang Lum, the father, and I couldn't read them, and I couldn't find anyone that could read them. So I actually found a man in his 90s who lives out in Southern California who was able to translate them for me because his parents had come directly from Canton and had spoken that in his home growing up. So he was able to read and speak Cantonese. But it's a language that is a clear marker of how your family, if you're Chinese, how your family came to this country, the class of that family and what region they're from, because the language is so localized and it's such a specific period in time that you're part of that wave of immigration from the turn of the century if you speak Cantonese. So that was a real challenge, and it was a gold mine. The fact that he was able to translate it was incredible. It gave me insight into kind of the inner life of Zhugang and the sacrifices he went through for his family that I just wouldn't have ever had I not found someone that was able and willing to translate that for me.
There's I believe there's a professor at UNO who's Chinese who has begun to delve into the study of that, and I kind of vaguely remember a presentation he did at the Folklore Society, and the challenge of Cantonese was one of his problems, but he had somebody in his family back in mainland China that he tracked down or something. But sorry to be vague about it, but it just all of a sudden flooded all over me. But we have, you're raising your hand? No, okay. You in the back. Okay.
As an ethnographer, I'm wondering if you ever felt that you had to ask permission for any of the people that were sharing information, whether you could call them informants or not. Did you ever feel that you had to ask permission indirectly or directly? Was that ever an issue to gather information for your stories?
Well, when you do oral histories, you have to ask permission to use them. You have to have them sign an agreement that will allow you to use it. As far as that photograph was concerned, I asked permission. Again, I had to get a photographic permission for them to sign that would allow me to use that. So yeah.
And a lot of this will be surprising to you, but writing nonfiction is not always a very lucrative career. And so a lot of what I was doing was grant funding. So I was working for the state of Mississippi, collecting some oral histories for them for archival purposes, and then using those. I was citing myself basically because I would deposit those oral histories in an archive and then use those oral histories for my book, and I was able to fund myself by doing this project through grant money. So in that case, you're following a very clear set of permissions guidelines that come directly from the state of Mississippi in terms of how they keep their records. So, you know, there's a lot of people who do similar types of work to be able to fund projects like this. So there's systems in place for making sure that you have permission and making sure that they not only permission, but that they understand how that information is going to be used later on. It may, you know, you could say exclusively for this work, but, you know, in the case of a lot of these, they're all publicly available. So anybody who wants to go back in and check my work, they're welcome to it. All that stuff is both digital and kept in the archives with Mississippi.
My answer's the same.
We've traveled a lot of the state, been to a lot of cultural events. This was the first year I've ever gone to the Isleños Fiesta. And what somewhat surprised me was the folk dancing was done by Canary Islanders.
Yeah.
Brought here, contemporary Canary Islanders.
Okay.
No one local was doing that.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how much, like I know the decimas, music tradition, how much is still practiced?
Okay. That's why I'm real careful to use the word vestiges of their colonial culture. There's probably one, the lead decima singer and the man who was very generous about going to festivals, you know, the Jazz Fest. He was in Boston. He was at the Carnegie Hall. He was awarded by the National Folklife Program. Anyway, he passed away. And I know his cousin, there may be 3 other people who sing decimas, but only when asked. So it's very thin. The Spanish dances were already, those dances that you saw on the dance floor, they would have danced at church festivals in the 1800s, but once the dance halls were built in 1900, they had begun to get away from church. They weren't as devout as the Spanish were or the French were. They began to be less devout, and they were being Americanized. They were dancing, you know, the jitterbug, the polka, and they were dancing to the music of Fats Domino. The dance hall owners would drive up to New Orleans and contract a talented black group, and they would go down there and sing Little Liza Jane until the cows came home. And they loved it. I mean, it just worked, you know. It was just this wonderful blending of cultures, you know, that we were talking about before. So they did have, the Isleños did have their own dance group. And this is going to be maybe before the storm. And they have the outfits, they worked with a seamstress from the Canary Islands. They visited, you know, local festivals, civic occasions and schools, and danced, you know, as a representation to edify people about the culture. But people are dying. I mean, yeah. So the language is still there, but it's probably just as thin as the decimas are.
Yeah, I know that's technically the only remaining Hispanicized part of the state, where that culture that you're saying remains so distinct that the language didn't vanish, that more of that. I knew that they had also settled in other areas. St. Bernard was the stronghold.
Yeah, it was the stronghold, and there is another organization in Baton Rouge that seems to be gathering strength to be able to, you know, show representations of these activities. Did I answer your question? Okay. Okay.
I kind of thought, oh no, I got here too late.
I get,
Yeah, but the beauty is, it just real quick, is that The Canary Islanders choral groups, those are not professional dancers and professional choral groups. Those are neighborhood groups. They came together at a church fiesta, and they all loved to sing, so they kept doing it. And then they got invited over here and made friends with the Isleños here, and now they go, they get here and they go on vacation to, what's Elvis Presley's place called? They go to Graceland, or the Isleños. Okay, so that's good, okay.
Okay, yeah.
So
You
it's-
can
so
pick
it's
it up.
nice.
We
It's a
got
nice
time for one last question. Do you have a question?
Well, my question is really future focused. Have any of you chosen the next project, the next book?
Yes. It's interesting. Today I was noticing in my Twitter feed that, they were marking on the anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, where all these women died. And so I'm going to be working on a book about the Rhythm Club fire in Natchez in 1940. And that actually was one of the most tragic of the fires. I mean, it's like even more people died in that fire than the one that they're marking today. And I think the reason people don't know about it is because they're African Americans who died in a period of Jim Crow. But there's a lot of really interesting connections between, there's the story is like threads of stories about fire safety, about the migration to Chicago, about the jazz era, these big bands that was coming there, that was playing that night. And so I'm excited to dig in. I've already started collecting information, and it helps that I've now done this work on Natchez, so I can go back and not have to start from scratch. I know the town.
Yeah, you got your peeps.
Yeah, I got my peeps. I don't think I'll need Bubba Chauvin this time.
I'm taking just a little hiatus. My husband and I raise sheep, so I've been sheep farming and keeping a sheep log, and I think maybe eventually, I started the project that I stopped doing to write this book was about, it was a memoir about me and my grandmother and how our lives are so different, and I think, we might find something like that later on, but right now it's just a lot of time herding sheep.
I don't have a book planned. I'm carefully following my intuition to get me wherever it is I need to be, and I may have a happy change or a happy surprise and come across my next book.
Well, thank you all. Thanks to everybody. Thanks for your attention. Thank you all. And,